Chapter 10. Continued. Again, Richter's appealed to Ferret. "He's dangerous, Ferret." Ferret shook his head. "When he plans to attack you, I'll know it." It was obvious to Kjaren that Richter's did not share his confidence, but any pity or understanding she had had for the man was gone now. Yet she found it hard to believe that anyone could have been as cruel as Richter's was. "It was all a lie, then," she said into the silence. "The Songhouse didn't refuse him. The Songhouse wanted him back." Richter said nothing. "You were clever," Ansett said to him. "In all our conversation that last day, you never once told me a lie. Never once. And I thought all your tension was because you were sad to see me go." Richter spoke at last, his voice husky. "I was sad to see you go." "Anywhere, to anyone. I was yours, is that it? I had to love you most, is that it? If I thought of the Songhouse as home, you couldn't bear that, could you? If I loved the Songhouse more than I loved this palace, then you'd take the Songhouse away from me, wouldn't you? Only you had to twist it so I'd hate them in the process, and not you at all. You couldn't have me hate you." The words seemed to slam visibly into Richter's, and he gasped at the end of Ansett's speech. Ansett may have no songs, but his voice was still a potent tool, and he was using it to savage Richter's. "I wanted your songs," Richter said. "You wanted my songs," Ansett answered bitterly, "more than you wanted my happiness. So you took my happiness and stole my songs." And then Kjaren made a connection in her mind, and realized that Richter's was not holding Joseph ransom against a song. "Ansett," Kjaren said. "Joseph." Ansett remembered, and the mask of control appeared again on his face. Time enough for hatred when Joseph was free. "I want Joseph. Now," Ansett said. "No," Richter said. "Aren't you through?" Ansett asked. "Do you think you can still save something? Or are you determined that if you can't have my love, and you can't, Richters, you can't, then no one can? If you ever loved me, Richters, you will let me have Joseph. Now!" "You can't, Richters, you can't. If you ever loved me, Richters." The words struck Richters hard. His face worked, though whether with anger or grief, Kjaren couldn't tell. "Call a guard," Richter said. "No," Ferret said. Richters arose from his throne. "Call a guard!" he roared, and Ferret left, returning a moment later with 2 guards. "Take them to the prisoner, to Joseph." The guards looked at each other, then at Ferret, who nodded and whispered something. The guards looked doubtful, but they led the way. Ansett and Kjaren followed. "He won't do anything to us, will he?" Kjaren whispered. Ansett shook his head. "Richters will never hurt me directly, or you, as long as you're with me. And as long as you're with me, no one can take you away." She looked at his face. Control was lagging. She saw the killer there, and was afraid. This should never have happened to Ansett. None of this. "How did they keep the Songhouse people from coming for you?" she asked. "If they really wanted you back, the Empire controls the space sports. Besides, if he could lie to me, he could lie to them. But that's past now. Time enough to set things right once we have Joseph back." Kjaren was baffled by the labyrinth of the palace, lost all sense of direction. But they went generally downward, into the prison, she assumed. But they made a certain turn that Ansett had not been expecting. He was taken by surprise and had to retrace a few steps. "What's wrong?" she asked. "He isn't in the prison," he said. "Then where?" "Hospital," Ansett answered. The guard stopped outside a door. "He's fairly drugged up. He isn't pretty right now, but Ferret said to let you see him as he is. I'm sorry." Then the guard opened the door, and they walked in, and they saw Joseph. At first, nothing seemed wrong with him, except the drugs. Joseph saw them, but his eyes showed no recognition, and his jaw hung partly open. He sat on a narrow bed, leaning against the wall. His legs were loosely apart, and his arms hung slackly beside him. He looked as if he never planned to move. Then Kjaren looked down, between his legs, just as Ansett saw and tried to block her sight. He was too late. She screamed, shoved past him, and, still screaming, took Joseph by the shoulders and pulled him toward her, embraced him in an agony of grief. He slumped against her, and his head tilted down. He drooled. She still heard herself shouting hysterically. Gradually she was able to stop, until finally even her spasmodic sobbing ended, and all was silent in the room again. She looked at Ansett. His face was terrible, not because of the emotion on it, but because there was nothing on his face at all. Carefully she leaned Joseph back against the wall. His head moved to the right so that he could not see her, but merely stared at the wall. He did not attempt to move. The drugs had him well in hand. "They plan to fit him with a permanent tube tomorrow," said one of the guards. Ansett ignored him, and Kjaran tried to. They started to push past him, but the guard raised a gun. It wasn't a laser. It was a tranquilizer. "Ferret said that after you saw, you weren't to be allowed back to the Great Hall." Ansett didn't pause, simply brought up his foot. The man's hand broke at the wrist. The gun dropped to the floor as the hand went slack and hung perpendicular to the floor. A moment for the pain to register, and the guard reeled out of the way. The other was too slow. Ansett took his face off with both hands, and Kjaran raced to follow the songbird as he shoved past the screaming guard, who knelt with his hands in front of his face, blood streaming down his arms. This was not the way they had come, Kjaran was sure, but Ansett seemed sure of where he was going, and it occurred to her that he wanted to avoid the ways where guards might be waiting. Also, he avoided any doors, finally coming to the great hall through the main entrance, which stood wide. Kjaran reached the doors a moment after Ansett passed through them, but already he was halfway across the floor, heading, not for Richter's, but for Ferret. Suddenly, Ansett was in the air, and Kjaran was expecting him, in his fury, to destroy the Emperor's assassin. But a moment later, Ferret and Ansett were grappling. None of Ansett's movements could penetrate the man's defenses. Ferret was unable to land a blow or a cut on Ansett's body. Finally, exhausted, they held each other firmly, neither able to move for fear the other would be able to use the movement against him. Ansett's mouth was near Ferret's ear. He moaned softly, and the moan was his agony of being unable to express what was in him, either with his body or with his voice. He could not kill, he could not sing, and he could not find another way to open what demanded to be open inside him. Ferret whispered triumphantly in his ear, "You've forgotten nothing." Richter spoke from the throne, where he was sitting again, relieved that Ansett's attack was not against him, relieved that neither fighter had been able to win. "Who do you think taught you how to kill that way, Ansett?" "I killed my teacher," Ansett said. "You were told you were killing your teacher," Richter's answered. "It was a lie." "You can't match me," said Ferret. "You were Mikal's servant, sworn to him," Ansett said. "I am the Emperor's servant," Ferret answered. "Mikal was old." It was one betrayal, one injury too many. It tore something inside Ansett. The barrier broke, and all the hurt of the years he had thought the Songhouse did not want him, all the grief at Joseph's mutilation, all the rage at Richter's lies, all the vengeance and hatred that had built within him, unable to be expressed. It all came out at once. Ansett sang again. But it was not a subtle song, as all of his had been. Much of his technique had been lost in the years of songlessness, and there was no attention to filling the room or displaying nuances of melody. It was an instinctive song, one that depended not on the veneer the Songhouse had put on Ansett's ability, but rather on the powers within him that the Songhouse had only gradually discovered, the power to comprehend exactly what was in other people's hearts and minds, reshape it, manipulate it, and change it until they felt what Ansett wanted them to feel. The song was terrible, even to Kjaran, who was at the edge of the room, and who could not understand it all because it was not sung to her. But to Richter's, who understood almost all of it, it was the end of the world. It was all his crimes held up to him, and against his will he felt guilt for them, a terrifying guilt like the eyes of God staring down his soul, like the devil's teeth gnawing at his heart. The furies fluttered passionately at the edge of his vision. He lifted up his voice in a vast scream that would have overshadowed any other sound, but not the sound of Ansett's songs. For it went on. It went on, filled with the colors of Ansett's love for Richter's, betrayed, Mikal's love for Ansett, destroyed, and the timidity, the gentleness and passion of Ansett's night with Joseph, forever out of reach. It was shaded by the darkness of Ansett's pain, as the best joy the body can receive was torn from him and replaced by the worst pain the body can endure. And as all those griefs and agonies filled the air, they were intensified by Ansett's long, long months of silence, with his songs stolen from him, his control partly broken. Now there was no control. Now there was nothing holding him in. The mayor of the palace heard Ansett's song like the death of some forest animal. but it would have been impossible to hear the sound inside. And then he heard Richter's scream. He shouted for guards. He raced for the great hall. He burst in. He saw Ansett, his face tipped upward toward the ceiling, the song still pouring from his throat like a volcano's eruption, seemingly endless, seemingly the death of the world. His arms were spread out, his fingers distended, his legs standing wide, as if the world were shaking and he was barely able to stay upright. Kjaran, leaning against the door, weeping for the parts of the song that she could understand. Richter's Macal, emperor of all mankind, lying on the floor, crying out again and again, begging for forgiveness, writhing to try to find a place where the sound wouldn't go. It had found him. Almost all the song had touched him, and he was insane, tearing at his clothing, blood coming from his face where his own nails had raked him. Hours before he had been serene and untouchable. Now he had been felled by a song. But not all the song. There were parts of the song that Richter's Macal could not understand. Este had been right about Richter's, when she felt that, like Macal before him, he was cruel but not without limits. Richter's, like Macal, had a love for, a sense of responsibility for mankind. What killing he might do, he did because it was needed, because of the goal he had in mind. And when the goal was achieved, he did not kill. Richter's did not understand all of the song because, while he was crueler than Este had thought he was also, in the end, partly kind. For there was a part of the song that spoke of death and loved death, that spoke of killing and loved killing. There was a part of the song that proclaimed that there must be expiation for the crimes, and the only payment that could be made was death, and that only he who loved death could pay that price. Only one person in the room understood that part of the song. The mayor of the palace looked last at Ferret, who alone was silent. He had torn his stomach open with his own hands. With his own hands he was throwing his bowels onto the floor. Again and again, with gushes of blood, he spilled himself. His face was in ecstasy. He alone in the room had found an outlet adequate for the pressure of the song. He kept on rhythmically destroying himself until at last he had found his heart. With the last of his strength he tore it from his chest, held it in his hands. Only then did he look down, and he watched his hands as they crushed the organ. It was his benediction. He could die. And as he fell to the ground, the song ended, and Richter's screams ended. The only sound in the hall was the mayor's heavy breathing and the soft crying of Kjaran at the other end of the hall. Richter spoke at last, his voice husky. "I was sad to see you go." "Anywhere, to anyone. I was yours, is that it? I had to love you most, is that it? If I thought of the Songhouse as home, you couldn't bear that, could you? If I loved the Songhouse more than I loved this palace, then you'd take the Songhouse away from me, wouldn't you? Only you had to twist it so I'd hate them in the process, and not you at all. You couldn't have me hate you." The words seemed to slam visibly into Richter's, and he gasped at the end of Ansett's speech. But any pity or understanding she had had for the man was gone now. Yet she found it hard to believe that anyone could have been as cruel as Richter's was. "It was all a lie, then," she said into the silence. "The Songhouse didn't refuse him. The Songhouse wanted him back." Richter said nothing. "You were clever," Ansett said to him. "In all our conversation that last day, you never once told me a lie. Never once. And I thought all your tension was because you were sad to see me go." Chapter 10. Continued. Again, Richter's appealed to Ferret. "He's dangerous, Ferret." Ferret shook his head. "When he plans to attack you, I'll know it." It was obvious to Kjaran that Richter's did not share his confidence. Kjaran said, "Joseph." Ansett remembered, and the mask of control appeared again on his face. Time enough for hatred when Joseph was free. "I want Joseph. Now," Ansett said. "No," Richter said. Aren't you through? Ansett asked. Do you think you can still save something? Or are you determined that if you can't have my love, and you can't, Richters, you can't, then no one can? If you ever loved me, Richters, you will let me have Joseph. Now! You each. Ansett may have no songs, but his voice was still a potent tool, and he was using it to savage Richters. I wanted your songs, Richter said. You wanted my songs, Ansett answered bitterly, more than you wanted my happiness. So you took my happiness and stole my songs. And then Kjaren made a connection in her mind, and realized that Richter's was not holding Joseph ransom against a song. Ansett,